We're back and talking about Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter. We're up to chapter 8 now, the chapter that is titled Fruits in the Church. It's actually titled Fruits of the Church, but I thought if we called it Fruits in the Church, at least Austin and I would have a lot more in common. Once again, joining us is my esteemed co-counsel, Kolby Reddish, as we go over this chapter, Fruits in the Church in the Light on Truth letter. We're going to have a lot of fun. Please join us. Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode, as I said, is Fruits in the Church. It's Radio Free Mormon, episode 403. We're covering chapter 8 of the Light on Truth letter. And when I say we, I mean myself and Kolby Reddish. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, RFM. Good morning.
It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too, my friend. As I look at the cold open there, and you've got that beautiful gray beard, I'm sitting there thinking, hanging out with RFM is making my beard grayer too. So
I bet it is. Yeah. Covering the entire Light on Truth letter is what's caused my beard to gray prematurely, I must say. But we're going through everything. We're reading every single word. It's like we're criticizing every word of this Light on Truth letter.
Yeah, I have had some recent run-ins with another apologist that just doesn't want people actually talking about their ideas or talking about their books. It's very weird to me. I can't imagine why someone would put ideas out in the world and not want people to talk about them. That's just so odd to me.
I know you must be talking about the famous Ed Goebel, son of George.
We're gonna have Ed Goebel. We're gonna have to cut that. He's way too crazy.
What? No. George Goebel. Remember George Goebel, the block on the Hollywood Squares? Remember George? You don't remember George Goebel. This is his son, Ed Goebel. Once you know the relationship, everything explains itself. Okay, so here we go. We have this opening slide. What does it say? It says the Light on Truth letter, Fruits of the Church. That is actually the name of the chapter.
Yeah. And this chapter, we're actually not going to go line by line and respond to everything. And I think
thank goodness.
That's one of the reasons I think I'm excited for this episode. We're really going to talk about how this chapter, even if we granted everything Austin has in this chapter, it doesn't move the needle one bit towards the actual truth of the claims of Mormonism. And so that will give us a good jumping off point to talk about logical fallacies, critical thinking, and link up with some of the other things we've talked about in the course of this series. So I'm really excited, and it's not going to be 4 hours. I promised RFM that. So
it's going to be 5?
No, it's not going to be longer than
1 hour. Are we shooting for 1 hour this morning?
We're shooting for it, but I think
we for 1 hour. Maybe we'll hit 2.
That's right. That's what I'm hoping. So if we'll get into it, let's go to the first little clip we have. This is to remind people.
That's right. It's right there. And what I'm going to do is I have got to go over to where the video is on a separate screen and present that. And now I'm just going to play this and let's see if it comes through. Okay.
Perfect. I just wanted to remind people that we covered this in an earlier episode. This is a clip of Austin Fife talking about the strongest argument for the truth of Mormonism when he appeared with our mutual friend Steve Pinecker on Steve's show talking about the Light and Truth letter.
Okay. All right. I think this is the one. Let's see if it works.
That you make in your book.
The longest chapter is called Fruits of the Church.
Okay.
It just outlines how good it is for people to be members of the church. Okay. Certainly people have bad experiences. Obviously that's true. And not everyone has a good experience. But by and large, when you're looking at the macro data, members of the church are doing really well. They live longer. They divorce at lower rates. They're healthier. They report, they're happier according to, self-reporting. And so that's, I think, the strongest argument is that members of the church are doing really well. And I think one of the questions my letter subconsciously answers, what I felt like, and part of the reason I wrote it to critics is I felt like when I interacted with critics, they were trying to get me into a corner where I felt like there's no way that.
Okay, wait a second. Why are you laughing there?
So I want to ask you,
Oh, hang on a second. I think I
what would you
just put it
say
back
is
to the
the
beginning.
strongest argument?
I just accidentally clicked it and put it back to the beginning. Why were you laughing there so rudely, Colby?
Because this is before he made changes to the letter because of our series, and I was just giggling because I still think this is the biggest problem with the letter is that it says it's written to critics, and Austin really doesn't want to address real critical positions. He wants to straw man them, and so that talking point is one of the biggest reasons I think we keep doing this. Is I feel like if Austin just pulled that line out of his introduction and was honest about the fact that this is written to the people who already believe this, that it's an exercise in motivated reasoning, I honestly would not care. It's the fact that, like we've talked about when we talked about this same interview he did with Pinecker, it's the fact that the Light and Truth letter gets used as a faith brick against people, and the arguments in it are getting used against people, that I think makes that line that I wrote this to critics just a real problem. I just don't think it's true.
Right. So you were laughing because he said, I wrote this to the critics, and we all know that's not true. He wrote this letter. Austin Fife wrote the Light on Truth letter to the audience who would accept whatever he says uncritically.
Exactly. And it's with that crowd, there's been absolutely no pushback, even on the things that we pointed out were just demonstrably incorrect. And that Austin seems to agree because he's made changes in light of our feedback on Nahum and some other issues. And so I just laugh when he says every time that it's written to the critics, or anytime I come across that while we're actually reading the letter and I see, those punchy questions he writes to critics.
So he
Supposedly.
thinks this is his most important chapter, and also it's the longest. So I guess those two go together. I had a tough time getting through it because it seemed like a bunch of snippets and quotes from different studies, which I'm suspecting are quoted to advantage, quoting only those parts that support his position. And without even looking at him, based on prior experience with Austin, it makes me wonder whether he's telling us the whole story. It makes me doubt, actually, whether he's telling us the whole story.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to open with that as well. This chapter, because we're not going to go line by line through it, is a lot like the chapter that we dealt with Elsie Walker, dealing with abuse in the church, and with Jacob Prescott, dealing with LGBTQ plus issues in the church. Both of them highlighted, like, in depth, how Austin very rarely understands or is correctly citing or correctly working from the studies that he uses. And so I'm with you. I suspect that would likely be the same result if we went line by line through it. But I wanted to start by just introducing this is the introduction to the chapter and basically how it opens. And so since we're not going to go line by line, I did at least want to read Austin's introduction, or if you wouldn't mind reading Austin's introduction, just so that people have his framing and we're not straw manning his position.
I would be happy to. He starts off with a quote from some ex-Mormon Twitter user, ex-user. Any good in Mormonism is available outside of Mormonism without the toxic cult mindset that Mormonism requires. That's the quote that he starts his chapter off with. Then he continues, even when my belief in God was at an all-time low, I could not deny how much good had come to my life through my membership in the Mormon church. It seemed obvious that the church was good for people. It just seems obvious, Colby. That's a good argument. It seems obvious that the church was good for people. By the way, in spite of all the quotes that he's going to cull, this isn't the only quote. He's going to have several quotes throughout this longest chapter in his letter from former members talking about how unhealthy the church was and how unhappy it made them. So he's going to quote all these people, but then he's going to say they don't know what they're talking about. They're outliers, because he actually says over and over, I don't know what church they're talking about. Because look at all these studies that I'm going to quote. And he's doing in this chapter the same thing he did with the women in the church, which is, look, I don't care what you have to say about your experience in the church. The studies prove that you're wrong, and actually you were happy in the church, regardless of what you say.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is it's like he doesn't recognize that a study, particularly self-reported studies, which are most of the ones that he's using here, like when you're asking someone to measure happiness, happiness isn't something you can put in a beaker or run a blood test and find the amount of happiness in someone's system, right? It is self-report, like it's a subjective experience. And so that's one of the things, as I was listening to your excellent panel last week, I was really struck by that Austin doesn't seem to recognize that like self-reported studies are just an amalgamation of a bunch of individual personal experiences, yet he wants to reject the individual personal experiences that he doesn't like and will rely on aggregated study data, sometimes that isn't even linked causally in any way to Mormonism, to make his points. It's very confusing methodology. I don't think he really understands the connection between anecdotal experiences and self-reported studies, because they're really just subparts of each other, or the one is subpart of the other.
Right. I'll
Right.
continue. I'm sorry. I distracted myself in the middle of his first paragraph.
No, great point.
He goes on from, it seemed obvious that the church was good for people. However, the more I listened to the critics of the church, the more I started to reflect. Does it just work for me? Does it cause harm to people? Was I unknowingly damaged? By the way, I think the first two of these questions are legitimate questions, and the third one maybe as well for reflection. So I've got
Mhm.
no problem with those questions, but he's rapidly going to turn this around and create a straw man out of what he began legitimately.
Right.
The critics wanted me to believe that the Church of Jesus Christ was not true and also not good. I wondered if my positive experience in the church was an anomaly. Maybe in reality, the church is bad for individuals. Okay, right there. That's where he segues and slips into the straw man of the black and white, the false dichotomy.
Right.
Either the church is good for everybody or it's bad for everybody. This is where he makes the fatal shift. I wondered if my positive experience in the church was an anomaly. Maybe in reality, the church is bad for individuals, families, communities, and the world. Are critics shedding light on a problem I was unaware of? Pardon the dangling participle. Is the church a drain on society? Do members suffer because of it? Well, obviously, some members suffer because of it, because look at what you're quoting.
Right.
Unless you're just saying that these people are making stuff up and lying about their experience.
And he said the same thing in the clip with Steve, right? He said, obviously, some people have a bad experience. And then
Yes.
he turns around and says, and not everybody has a good experience, which is the same thing. And I get it. We stumble over our words when we're talking live too.
Yeah.
But I thought with that framing, because today we're also going to talk about the idea of falsifiability. And I think you raised an excellent point of the fact that Austin here is presenting a false dichotomy. But here I'll defend Austin a little bit and say he came by this false dichotomy honestly. And what I mean by if you'll go to the next slide, we're going to look at where this test that Austin is trying to apply, or where the title of this chapter, this fruits of the church, comes from. So it comes from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7.
Or in
where
Third
Jesus,
Nephi.
or in Third Nephi, if you want to go with the fictional version, because this version's, obviously absolutely true. No,
I would say the version in Third Nephi is only as fictional as the one in Matthew.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
Except for the context.
Yeah, except for the setting, time, and place, and
those things.
Greek words, or the Greek and the words that were cultural that real Nephites would have never understood that are used.
Yeah.
The point of sharing this is when
Mhm.
we're dealing with the actual test, or we're talking about this concept, this fruits of the church concept, I thought it was important context to remember where this actually comes from, because it's a very often apologetic, not just by Austin, that's used for proponents of the church and by apologists to say, look at the church's fruits. But I thought it was important to set this context and look at what Jesus, at least as is reported in Matthew, actually said here. This test of fruits is not applied to a church. It's not applied to a truth claim. It's applied specifically to false prophets or true prophets. And
Yes.
the thing that is very interesting, and we'll read it here in just a minute, is that the false dichotomy that you're noting in Austin's opening chapter comes right from Matthew chapter 7. It is a absolute binary in that, I've emphasized the one verse here, but I'll go ahead and read this since you read the last slide for me. In Matthew 7, starting at chapter 15, it says, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. And then to really drive this false dichotomy home, here is the verse I think that really shows. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. So the thing that's very interesting to me about this, and you've shared this with me before, is that when apologists use this test that comes from Jesus and Matthew, they're not even following the terms of the test. The test is for a false prophet.
Right.
The second point is that I do believe this false dichotomy that Austin uses, that the church either has to be bad for everybody, good for everybody. That's basically what Jesus says in Matthew. If you read the test literally, it says that a good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit. And so the other thing I have to notice is from that clip we played from Austin with Steve Pinecker, is that he admits that not everyone has a good experience in the church. He admits that people have bad experiences in the church. This is where I think it's important to actually look at the test that we're supposedly applying here and see whether it even meets the terms of the test, because this is actually an internal argument failure on Austin's part. He's using a test and completely ignoring what the test actually says as he's acknowledged reality.
He should be using this test to measure President Nelson as a
Correct.
prophet, or potentially his counselors in the Quorum of the 12. Only those men who are sustained as prophets in the church.
Right. And he
Using this test, I'm not sure they measure up too well.
Oh, well, and to be fair, I'm not sure anyone would. And that's the thing that's so interesting about these types of arguments from apologists, is when it's convenient to them, they will defend the church like you would be able to defend any other organization. Because the reality is, neither you or I today are going to argue or attempt to argue that the church is bad for everybody, because that would just be untrue. The church is better for some people, probably that rigid structure, the values it can give people. Some people need to have a little bit more direction in their lives, or want a little bit more direction in their lives. It's where apologists move away from what the church actually claims about itself, and they defend it like it's any other institution, right? They'll point to things like being part of a country, being part of a city, being part of any other type of organization, while completely ignoring that's not what this organization claims about itself.
Yes. And later on, as I mentioned, where he gets into this either or, this dichotomy, he puts himself in a position where he's arguing for something that he can't possibly prove, because nothing is either completely good or completely bad. Nobody is completely good or completely bad. Jesus included, by the way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a great point.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Oh, what's this?
Yeah. So because we are not going line by line and responding to every bit of this chapter, I thought this would be a fun little thing, since we share the legal field and people like hearing about how this stuff sometimes can connect to the work we're doing here. I thought it would be fun to explain what a demurrer is. So a demurrer, or a certain type of a motion to dismiss, today they're often known as 12b6 motions, because in civil practice, that's the rule of civil procedure that they're made under. A demurrer is essentially an argument that someone can bring in a lawsuit, a defendant can bring in a lawsuit to say, I'm going to admit factually everything that person has said in their complaint or petition or whatever the originating pleading is. And here's why that is of no legal significance, and I either need to be dismissed or the case should be dismissed. And so I thought that it poses a really interesting analogy to what we're going to do with this chapter. We are not going to contest Austin's use of these studies. We're not going to go through them line by line. I suspect if we did, they would be as poorly researched and drafted as the previous chapters where he's used these studies would be. But to be fair, I don't know that because that would be, fallacious thinking, and we're not going to do that today. I thought this posed an interesting way to say, this is basically what we're doing today. We're saying, Austin, we're going to accept every fact you have about those studies as true. And here's why that is of absolutely no significance if you really care about the truth claims of the church being true.
Do you think it's fallacious thinking to have caught Austin Fife or any author time after time misusing studies, misreporting the conclusions of the studies on several occasions, then see him reporting studies in another chapter and think it's more likely, because of what we've already caught him doing, that he's doing the same thing now?
So it depends on exactly what the claim is. If the
I think
claim
this is
is
a
the way-
404B motion.
Exactly. The claim is if you phrase it the way you just did, I would not say that is fallacious reasoning, because that is dealing with like the statistical probability and basically saying which is more likely. Now, if we were to say Austin's Previous chapters where he analyzed sociological data were so poorly researched and drafted. So this one absolutely is probably also poorly researched and drafted. That then would be fallacious because
But you
we're
threw in
taking.
probably after your absolutely.
Oh, did I? Well, that's just
Yeah.
because I haven't scripted it out. Sorry.
I would agree with you. Absolutely. He's probably doing the same thing again. But no, if you're saying absolutely he's doing the same thing again, yeah, that would be too far.
Yeah. Yep. And I thought that 404B analogy was perfect. That's where my mind was going, right? There's a reason that we don't allow just general propensity arguments in court. It's because, yeah, our brains do often want to think that fallacious thinking is the way to reach a conclusion. They're mental shortcuts that our brains do, but they can often be deceiving. They're a lot like a mirage in the desert, right? The logic of them seems sound and is often very appealing, but we'll talk a little bit later about why they're not a legitimate path to truth.
Yes. Mirages in the desert or the shadows of camels. If you get it, you get it. Hope you're doing well, Michelle. Okay. So you ready for the next one?
I am.
By the way, this is a slide for those who are listening at home. This is Bart Simpson at the chalkboard at the beginning of every Simpsons episode. But on this one, he's writing over and over, I will not file frivolous lawsuits.
Right. The type of frivolous lawsuit to which one would file a demurrer. And that's why I used that. Perfect.
Very good.
So to talk about the actual topics addressed, again, since we're not going to go in depth, I pulled these from the headings throughout the chapter, like the subchapter headings, just so that people can get a feel for what Austin argues in this chapter if they want to go and read it, which I would suggest that they do. We both did in preparation for this. The topics addressed range from health benefits of being in the church, the benefits to society that church members bring, basically generally, that Latter-day Saints are highly religious. That's because Austin is using he did this in the Women in the Church chapter 2. He uses like general religious affiliation study data to then argue that that's directly applicable to Mormonism. And so that's the way he has to link it, right? By saying that Latter-day Saints fall within this group of highly religious people. They live longer, their marriages are more stable, they're happier, they have better social connection and volunteerism, they have a dedication to family history. Being a member of the church can teach you delayed gratification. That one's kind of funny to me, just that it's a heading, because delaying gratification is only useful if the gratification comes. And much of the delayed gratification in the church comes in the supposed afterlife, which may or may not exist.
It's eternally delayed gratification.
Yeah. Yep. And
By
then
the way, I did, when I got to the heading in his chapter that said, Latter-day Saint marriages are more stable, I admit I almost choked.
I just think it's so impressive that there's so many things that Mormonism can help you with. It almost sounds like an ad, an infomercial ad that I'd hear on late night television.
And I could hear my dad saying to me, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah.
All you have to do is become a Mormon and you will be happy, happy, happy. And you'll have all of these benefits is what he's advertising.
Yeah, that is the argument, basically. The church is true because it brings you these benefits. And you heard it in Austin's clip with Steve Pinecker, where he basically says there are all these good effects that come from being a member of the church. So let's talk about why we're filing our demurrer. If you'll move to the next slide, perfect. So we're going to hit on 2 logical fallacies today with specific examples from the Light and Truth letter and talk about their application here. And the reason is because if we're dealing with fallacious reasoning, what we're really pointing to is the fact that the argument that's fallacious has no practical significance. That's why it connects with this idea of a demurrer, right? A demurrer is filing a legal motion that says, I admit everything you say, and it has no legal significance. We're doing the same thing just from the point of view of argumentation. We're saying
on this whole chapter 8.
On this whole chapter, we can say, we admit everything you've said is true, and here's why it doesn't matter. The reason is because it's fallacious reasoning, as I'll explain here in a minute. For those who haven't done a deep dive on understanding logical fallacies, I would just recommend that this was the first step I did when I was going through my faith crisis. I can't remember exactly who recommended that I start with like critical thinking 101 and logical fallacies, but that really set the tone for the rest of my entire faith crisis. Because when you study even the basics of epistemology, it is giving you tools that will speed up your own learning, right? In AI, right now, they're talking about this idea of artificial general intelligence, which is like a cascade that's caused when an artificial intelligence is able to improve upon itself and build better versions of itself. And I feel like critical thinking and epistemology 101 are the things that can help you increase your capacity to understand this stuff. So my big suggestion, anytime people reach out to me and say, I'm new in this space, I'm just going through a faith crisis, what do you suggest I do? I always say, slow down, study hard, and think about critical thinking and logical fallacies 101, because that's what will arm you against the bullshit arguments, frankly, that are so prevalent in this space, particularly from apologists.
I would have recommended that course of action to Austin Fife. In fact, I was about to make a little quip there that Austin Fife should have done this before he started his letter. The strange thing is that he actually did, apparently. And that was his first chapter.
And then committed most of them, yeah.
Yes. Here's all the logical fallacies he writes in his first chapter, which I intend to commit multiple times throughout the rest of this letter.
Right. So I pulled this information from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a great resource that people have access to that's free, that has really well-sourced information for that critical thinking epistemology 101. This is from their page that defines fallacies, and I really liked this encapsulation of why fallacious reasoning is such a problem. Because one of the things that's very surprising to me is whether it's, talking to folks like Austin or talking at folks like Austin, because he won't talk to us, or talking on Reddit with some junior apologist types, I'm often surprised how often members of the church or apologists will just admit that their reasoning is fallacious and then say it doesn't matter. And that is so surprising to me, because here's why fallacious reasoning matters. So Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines it as two competing conceptions of fallacies are that they are, number one, false but popular beliefs, and that they are two, deceptively bad arguments. And I really like that one, and I think it connects with that idea of the mirage of the oasis in the desert. Then says, being able to detect and avoid fallacies has been viewed as a supplement to criteria of good reasoning. The knowledge of fallacies is needed to arm us against the most enticing missteps we might make with arguments, or we might take with arguments. So the way I think about this is our brains have evolved and have been given to us that have many good tools, but they also have many bad tools. They have many shortcuts that they make. And logical fallacies often hook directly into those shortcuts. Think of it like the old times on the Old West, on the Oregon Trail. You've got the wagons that are going forward, and you've got these deep cut wagon ruts, right? That's what it was. Logical fallacies, many of the logical fallacies are exactly like that, but for our brain wanting to think poorly. And I'll give you the perfect example. One of the fallacies that is most often is the bandwagon fallacy, which is the idea that I can't be wrong if most people agree with me, right? If I'm siding with what most people believe, I'm probably safe.
That 1 billion Chinese can't be all wrong.
That's right. Which is fallacious thinking. How popular a belief is speaks to one question: how popular the belief is. It doesn't mean that it's absolutely correct. There were times in the history of this earth where most people believed that the earth was flat. They were all absolutely wrong. They just didn't have the capacity to know it yet. So I guess my suggestion to kind of close out this slide is, if anyone ever uses John 6 or the language from John 6, where will you go? What will you do if you leave the church? If they try and use that language against you as a faith cudgel, I think you should loud and proud say it with all of your chest that you are developing better thinking skills through critical thinking 101 and studying epistemology and logical fallacies. Because if the church could hold up to that scrutiny, that doesn't mean you have to leave the church. It means you'll just have better tools to evaluate the evidence as you process whatever you're going to study as you make that decision.
Very good. This whole thing reminds me of one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes quotes, which is, there is nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact.
Right. Oh, that's so true. Yes. And the other thing I would say to connect to that is, I think it is very important for all of us, believers, post-Mormons, liberal, conservative, man, women, all of us, to recognize that our brains are hardwired to accept fallacious reasoning and to engage in cognitive biases. We have to, and because of that, we have to purposefully build in feedback loops to guard against these things. That is the very first step in furthering your process of thinking. It's the real version to me of the feeling I would feel when I'd sing the hymn, "Oh, say what is truth."
Mm. What was that feeling like?
It feels like you're exercising discipline, epistemological discipline, and epistemological humility. That's the best way I can think to describe it. In fact, I actually have a graphic I prepared later that kind of will hint at the way it feels to me. So
I had a friend who since passed recently, unfortunately, but he once talked to me about that hymn, "Oh, say what is truth." And he says, "RFM, have you ever noticed that there's a question mark at the end of that sentence? Oh, say what is truth?" Because the Mormon church really isn't that sure.
yeah, and I'm thinking more too about your question, like what would it have felt to me? The scriptural phrase I would have used to describe that feeling is in Alma 32, which is the way I would
Enlightening
often
of the mind.
enlightening of the mind. Yeah,
Sorry, I just thought I'd throw it out there because that appealed to me very much too. I related to. I felt like I related to that, and so I hooked into that expression.
absolutely. That passage in Alma 32 is the one I would most often use to describe the way the Spirit felt to me, the way I experienced the
Me
Spirit.
too.
Because it was enlighten your understanding, enlarge your soul. That one I always use the analogy of the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes that day. So as we talk about the fallacies that are prevalent in this chapter, we've already hit the high points of what Austin's actual argument is. The strongest fallacy that he's using in this chapter is the argument from consequences. And in fact, we've talked about this before. So, an argument from consequences, or also known as an appeal to consequences, is a fallacious argument that proposes that a hypothesis or belief is either true or false based on whether the premise leads to desirable or undesirable consequences. So, the example I have here, which is an actual conversation I had with a believing family member of mine, is there has to be an afterlife, because if there isn't, then all of our suffering would be pointless. I like knowing that there is a savior that will come and make everything better. Can you highlight in that example, RFM, why it's an argument from consequences?
Well, I think it's because this person wants to have meaning in life so that suffering's not pointless, that a savior has to come because that will make everything better, all that suffering. So I think the consequence is suffering's bad, but the savior's there and he's going to make it better.
Exactly. It's only a comforting notion if you already accept that there's a purpose to the suffering, right? It's allowing oneself to be subjected to wishful thinking. That's the danger here. That's the danger of an argument from consequences. Is sometimes the truth is hard. Sometimes the truth comes with change. Sometimes the truth comes with really difficult decisions and really difficult conversations. It's something I actually think is very damaging about being raised in the church. Is you are taught from such a young age that negative feelings are associated in some way with Satan or the spirit of contention. And so it will often result in people running. This is how, at least how I felt. I can just say it that way. I felt that I was often running from hard feelings in my life to my own detriment, because I was afraid that bad feelings meant it was speaking to something deficient in my righteousness or in my participation, in my belief. And so that's one of the dangers here, is that if we only want to believe the things that are comfortable, we run the risk of believing things that are comfortable but not true. This argument from consequences, and in fact, this example reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Carl Sagan, which his daughter Sasha shared in her book "For All Creatures Such as We," where he told her once when she was a young girl, it is dangerous for us to believe in things just because we wish them to be true. And he was actually sharing with her, his sorrow at losing one of his parents or one of his close family members. And so you can see it hooks directly to this example. Those beliefs can absolutely be comforting, but the fact that they can be comforting does not mean that they are true. That is where the fallacious reasoning comes in.
A scene from Shakespeare comes to mind, surprisingly. But this is Malvolio. It's from Twelfth Night. It's a very famous scene. And here's the deal, very broken down. Okay. Malvolio is this guy. He's a steward. He's got a total crush on his lady. Okay. The lady who is in charge of the household.
Mhm.
Anyway, he's totally crazy about her. He will find anything to be assigned from her. And some other people who are playing a trick on him decide that they're going to scrawl out a letter and leave it in a place where he can find it and it's going to be ostensibly signed by the lady that he has the crush on, right?
Mhm.
This letter does not say anything about him directly. Okay. It's a masterpiece, both Shakespeare. And when he reads the letter, what he does is he bends over backward to interpret meaningless scribbles as evidence that his lady is absolutely in love with him. And by the time he's done with it, he's totally convinced himself that he's got it made and they're going to end up getting married. Of course, this would be high above his station,
Mhm.
but he knows that she's in love with him. And it occurs to me that this is the danger of an argument from consequences. This is for comedic effect. But what he's doing is his argument is so bad, but it's so bad because he wants that consequence so much.
Exactly. And again, coming back to my comment on the general fallacy slide, all of us are susceptible to this. When I'm sharing these thoughts or we're talking about these fallacies, this is not me just lecturing Austin and saying I'm immune from these things. That's again why it comes back to building in better feedback loops and understanding why our brains find these things so palatable. Because of course we want to believe things that make us happy. Of course we don't want to accept things about our reality that make us sad, but sometimes reality is sad. Sometimes things don't make us happy. And that's where we really have to weigh, what do we care most about? Do we care most about truth, or do we care most about comforting ourselves? Because sometimes that salve may just be imaginary.
Yeah, and I did want to point out, as I pointed out before, that there is a very famous logical fallacy called an appeal to authority.
Mhm.
This church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is based upon that logical fallacy. Everything in the church is an appeal to an authority. They even call them general authorities.
Yeah,
All right.
so true. So let's actually apply this fallacy to Austin's argument. So if you'll go forward one more time, remember, here are the topics he addressed. Here are all these benefits of being a member of the church. I'm surprised it can't cure erectile dysfunction. That feels like the only thing on the list that he didn't say that you get as a benefit for being a member of the church. So let's actually directly apply it. So the chapter primarily highlights the positive outcomes, examples, stronger families, better mental health, charitable services, happiness, that Austin attributes to religious involvement. And it warns of the negative consequences of leaving the church, like lower well-being and meaninglessness. In philosophical terms, this is an argument from consequences. It suggests that because religious observance, and Mormon religious observance specifically, leads to good societal and individual outcomes, rejecting the religion must be a bad choice. Essentially, the moral or practical value assigned to those outcomes is used to support belief in the church. And this is actually one reason I think we can have this conversation with believers, because if they would simply admit that they're more concerned, at least when they're making these arguments, with the practical value of being a member of the church, they won't really get any complaint from me. If the data speaks to that, and in some ways it does speak to positive benefits from being associated with religion. Now, I would say then they're using false cause, because I would say the likely cause of them actually being or getting those good benefits is because they're part of a community. They have structure. It's easier to replicate some of those things. Also, religion can just help you deal with hard times, like we talked about, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the truth claims of the religion are true. And at least for me and where I'm in, I'm very happy to say and own that I really only want to be a member of the church, or any church, if the truth claims of the church are actually true. I don't need the societal benefits or the personal benefits at the expense of truth. I recognize other people may weigh those values differently, and truthfully, I don't even judge them for weighing them differently. If my life had shaken out in different ways with regard to my spouse, my partner, my kids, I may weigh them differently too. But that's where I think if we're just honest about what we actually see in this evidence and the arguments we're actually using to reach our conclusions, we can have better discourse with each other.
Yeah, let me set forth my position on this, just for comparison purposes with Austin's. I think that the church is good for some people. I also think the church is bad for some people, which means I can take Austin's opinion, his personal opinion, at face value, and I can also take the opinions of the people that he's quoting from Twitter or X, negative about their experience of the church, at face value, because I recognize you can have a different experience in the church, good or bad, or somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
I know this because the church was very good for me during my first few years as a member of the church, and that includes my mission. It was very good for me, but I outgrew it. And then the church wouldn't let me go. And there ended up being sort of a tug of war as I entered my teenage years spiritually with the church, and they were the parent who was trying to keep me in check. So that's my position. And I think Austin gives lip service to that position. But when he comes down to making his argument, it gets a lot more black and white, because here's the deal. Mormons believe that you can only be truly happy in the Mormon church. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later. But Mormons believe you can only be truly happy in the Mormon church. Everything else is a shadow of happiness. It's not real happiness outside the church. You're not really happy. You might only joy in the church, right? Joy is the word.
That's what I was going to say. For people who would say, oh, Mormons don't really believe that. Like President Nelson literally said that only in the church can you have true joy.
Yes. And this is what we've known forever, because it's not like it started with President Nelson. So here's the thing, and I'll just explain this quickly. I will go into the brief detail, okay? Because I want to make this clear at the outset. All Mormons know this. And the reason we know this is because it's in our Book of Mormon. It's in our scriptures. First off, the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi chapter 2 says, Adam fell, that's the original Adam, first guy. Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. Men are that they might have joy. That's the reason of our existence. This is not a scripture that's hidden away and doesn't get talked about a lot in the Mormon church. This gets repeated over and over and over. Our very purpose of existence is to have joy, and we will have joy if we follow the path that leads to it, and that is doing everything you're supposed to do as a good Mormon, which means true joy is not available outside the Mormon church. It's only available to those who are faithful in the Mormon church. Okay, second scripture, which is in Alma 41, verse 10, I think. It was a scripture chase, a seminary scripture as well back in the day. Wickedness never was happiness. Wickedness never was happiness. Okay, so you can't be wicked, you can't be disobedient and be happy. The only way you can be happy is by being the opposite of wicked, righteous. It's right there. It's very, very simple. So the funny thing is that you said about President Nelson is that Austin is actually going to conclude this chapter. I made a separate slide of it just before we started with the quote from President Nelson, which is saying exactly that thing. Okay. He's making the promise. How many times have we heard the promises from the prophets? He's going to do it again. If you do what it is I'm telling you today, I promise you that. Right. And it's always good stuff. You will have increased happiness, increased joy, increase this, increase that. And those are the promises that are based upon obedience to Mormon tenets. Okay. And that's what it's all about. Back in the 70s, it was Paul H. Dunn. I remember hearing this talk on my mission. Must have been on a tape. But he said about Mormons and happiness and enthusiasm, that we as Mormons, if we really understand our religion, we should just bounce through life. That was the expression that stuck in my head. We should just bounce through life because we know the truth. We're happy. We're headed for great things. We're experiencing great things here. We've got the blessings of God. Remember the blessings of God being poured out upon all those who are obedient. Okay. So that's what Mormons know. So having said that much, Mormonism is associated with happiness. It's not just an idea. It's actually a doctrine of the church. It's in the scriptures, which means that if you are a Mormon, you are expected to be happy, and you know it. You are expected to be happy, and you know it. Which
Absolutely.
means that if you are a Mormon and someone asks you about your state of happiness, you are almost certainly going to overreport the actuality. Because the other part of Mormonism is that it is a missionary church. I don't suppose I have to spend a lot of time elaborating on that fact. It's a missionary church. We're trying to get other people to join and get other people to join by showing how good the church is for its members, which is really what Austin's doing here in this entire chapter. He's just doing that, showing how great the church is for its members. So come on and join. Come on in. The water's fine. And all I'm saying is that if you take a Mormon and ask them if they're happy, their first temptation is going to be to overreport happiness. Yes, I'm very, very happy. Why? Because I'm a Mormon, and that's what I'm supposed to say, because that's the doctrine of the church,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what you really feel inside.
Yeah, and that last line, regardless of what you feel inside, it's not just happiness that the church teaches you to do this with, right? This is the concept known as spiritual bypassing, which is basically bypassing what I was talking about earlier, running from hard feelings or running from situations you don't want to deal with and using spirituality as an out. Now, where that can be a legitimate space to just use it for processing is something I'll have to leave to people who believe, just because I don't anymore. But I think you're absolutely right about everything you said. And the scripture I always go to, and I'm often so surprised the way apologists seem to argue like Mormonism is not based on this idea that if you keep the commandments, you're blessed. Basically, that it works.
Mhm.
That it works. Well, in fact, it's like a works-based church, right? And that's the whole idea. Because Mosiah 2:41 is another scripture I would add to your list where it says, I would that you would consider on the blessed and happy state of those that keep the commandments of God. The obvious import of that being, using your
They are
example,
blessed in all things, both
they are
temporal
blessed.
and spiritual. And if they hold out faithful unto the end, they shall be received into heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for showing me up. That was wonderful.
Oh, remember, my son, that these things are true, for the Lord God hath spoken it.
Yeah, and that's King Benjamin, and it's so foundational to the Book of Mormon. And for what it's worth, if we think about the fact of Metcalf's theory of Messiah priority, it would have been one of the first things that was written. Joseph
Yeah.
Smith starts the book with this conditional promise. It's built into the Doctrine and Covenants too, right? Obedience is the first law of heaven. Everything works, and in my mind now, I can see such a clear analogy to Joseph Smith's history as a treasure digger. The whole idea that you have to do the spell correctly. It's almost like this totemic magic, right? And
Mhm.
that's the way that the God of Mormonism works. Is if you keep the commandments, you're blessed. They even use the scripture. I used it all the time on my mission, where Jesus Christ is teaching in the New Testament, and I think it's in John, and he says, "If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself."
I think it's
This
either 7:17 or 8:32. Those are both seminary scriptures that I get confused in John.
I'm positive it's 7:17. I couldn't remember if it's 7:10 or 7:13, but yeah, 7:17. I'm almost positive. And I think the way you framed that is such a perfect example because it's going to link into our next logical fallacy. Now that we've covered the argument from consequences, now we're going to talk about begging the question. And for this, I made this adorable little toaster whose name, of course, is Clobby the toaster.
Oh,
Um,
I thought it was Thomas. He looks kind of like Thomas the toaster.
he
He
does
looks a
look
little
like
like a steam engine I used to know.
Yeah, okay, we'll call him Tom K. Toaster, that works.
But I can't
Um,
believe that's safe to be plugging himself into himself. I think that
yeah.
might be a violation of the law of chastity.
Yes. Ironically, a little factory touching its little factory. So if we talk about begging the question, and then we'll talk about how the graphic obviously connects with the toaster plugged into itself. So begging the question is a logical fallacy that assumes the conclusion in the argument's premises, assuming the things that need to be demonstrated. It is circular reasoning disguised as logic. The argument never leaves its own assumption behind. This isn't an argument about evidence. It's an argument that assumes the belief leads to better outcomes because it is true. But that assumption itself is the conclusion that still needs to be established.
So if you're talking about an argument, you're talking about premise number one, premise number two, and then the conclusion that is drawn from those two premises, correct?
Correct.
Like Socrates is a man, all men have two legs, therefore all men are named Socrates.
That
Now
would
that's
be
a false conclusion.
yeah, that would be a formal logical fallacy because
And actually, even the premise, all men have two legs, is not correct.
false. Correct.
Because doesn't mean Socrates, you can't prove Socrates had two legs that way because maybe he only had one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's when we're actually getting into like really syllogistic logic. So you can have two types of fallacies. The ones we're talking about today are informal logical fallacies, which are like these ruts that we talked about earlier that our mind has pre-programmed into them. I think the classical highlight to me of begging the question is when someone is arguing that a proposition is true simply because it is internally consistent. That's why we have the toaster plugged into itself. It sets its own standards and then fulfills the standards.
Let me say this.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Uh,
I was
So
just
if you
going to
got
say,
two premises and a conclusion, all right?
right.
It is critical for the conclusion to be correct that your two premises are also correct. Because if either one of your premises are correct, you can have a logically consistent argument, but it leads to the wrong conclusion.
Mhm.
So if one of your, or both, but let's just say one of your premises is incorrect and you come to the conclusion, you have begged the question on that incorrect premise because you have assumed that it's correct when it's not.
Yeah, and I think formally it would look more like part of the conclusion, because RFM's talking about like an actual syllogism. So if we were to break out an actual syllogism and have, P1, P2, and then the conclusion, we would be dealing with a situation where the conclusion, part of the conclusion, is baked into one of the premises, and so it becomes circular in that way. I really like the way you said it, that obviously the premises need to lead to the conclusion. The conclusion has to flow from the premises, otherwise it's just an invalid argument. It's not valid
Right.
in structure. I think a classic hallmark of begging the question again is this idea that someone is pointing to their argument and saying, look, my argument is internally consistent. Now, this is where we've talked about this reasoning error before, where people think that the lack of disconfirming evidence or a disconfirming trait in an argument means that the argument is then true, right? Because an argument has to be internally consistent. But to point to the fact that an argument is internally consistent and then say, look, this is true because it's internally consistent. Well, so is Spider-Man. So is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's why begging the question can feel true that, hey, this is an internally consistent argument, but the fact that it's internally consistent doesn't mean it's actually been demonstrated to exist in reality. And so
Let's say the Book of Mormon were completely internally consistent, which it's not.
right.
There's a lot of consistency, but there's a lot of inconsistency, frankly. But let's say it's completely consistent. Just because the Book of Mormon is internally consistent doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly. And we can see this in the example on the next slide. So the example is, and this is the basic argument of this entire chapter, living the gospel brings happiness. How do we know? Because people who live the gospel say that they're happy. How do we know their happiness is real? Because it comes from the gospel. And I think, I haven't broken it out like in formal structural logic, because I think sometimes that can get a little heady for people, even for me. But you can see just in reading, a more colloquial argument, how circular this is, right? It looks exactly circular because it is, because it's begging the question.
Very good. And you go on to say, oh, I got to tell you the story here.
Please do.
Really quick. You're going to love this story. We had a Chinese foreign exchange student who came to live with us for a school year. This is a number of years ago. I was still going to church, so it was probably around 2010. Anyway, he's a great kid. He comes over. He's a senior in high school. He wants to do everything. He wants to get the full experience. And at this point, I don't want to put any pressure on this kid to go to church with me, because newsflash, a lot of Mormons will sponsor exchange students, foreign exchange students, in order to get them to go to church and try and convert them. That may not be the only reason, but it's certainly one of the things that they're trying to do, because we're Mormons and that's what we do. It's a missionary church by hook or by crook, right? But I talked to him and I said, look, we go to church every Sunday. There's absolutely no expectation that you're going to go to church. There's no obligation on you. But he wanted to go anyway because he wants the full experience. So he goes. It's got to be September, school year starting. It's the first Sunday. It's fast and testimony meeting. And we sit there and we listen through a regular, typical, standard Mormon fast and testimony meeting with all the people getting up there bearing their testimony. I didn't get up and bear my testimony. I think it had been a while since I had, and I certainly wasn't going to do it today, and I didn't want him to think there's any pressure from me. So we get done, closing prayer, closing hymn, and people are getting up and they're starting to leave the chapel, going on to their next meeting. And so I looked at him and I said, so what'd you think? And he looked at me thoughtfully and he said, why is everyone so sad? And I looked at him. My eyes probably bugged. My jaw probably dropped a little, because he was right. Oh my gosh. I needed this outsider to come in and look at this and help me realize that everybody, almost without exception, who went up there was very, very sad. and crying, not tears of joy, but tears of tears, right?
Hmm.
Tears of sadness as they're bearing their testimony about how happy they are in the church and how much it's blessed them. And his question to me as a complete outsider, it hitting him new, was, why is everyone so sad?
Hmm.
Because that is a large reality in the LDS church. I'm not saying it's the total reality, but it's a large reality in the LDS churches that many, many people are sad. And a lot of those people bear their testimonies and they cry and they're obviously distraught and sad, but still they're hanging in there and they're bearing their testimony. What do you think about that story?
Yeah, that story, it connects with experiences I had a lot when I was first leaving the church. And I would meet with, for people who don't know, I'm going to assume most who would listen do. But I kind of left the church in a very public way, which if I could redo it, I'm not sure I would do, because it brought with it a lot of, well, let's just say, I can't change the past, but it brought with it a lot of interesting conversations. And many of the conversations I would have, like right after that summer that my wife and I left the church, would be with people who knew me, who were never Mormon, but who knew me either as a law student or a former employee or a former coworker. And they'd take me out to lunch and talk about, they would just talk to me completely freely about the church and what they thought about the church. And it was the first time I'd ever realized that, and people who are believers are not going to believe this, and that's fine. I don't really care. I really thought that members of the church had like a really high cachet in the community. And they do in some ways for certain things. But man, most people who are never Mormon think Mormonism is really, really weird, really, really culty. And it oftentimes makes them very, very uncomfortable. The most recurring comment I heard from those people was similar to the story you told, were comments about how I just seemed so much happier and so much lighter. Like people who had known me for years were seeing a difference in me. So I guess it's more the inverse. But yeah, I've had experiences like that before where I had to recognize it's only with the voice of this outside influence that I can see how weird some of these process or practices that are routine in the church really are.
Did you want to say something more about this slide?
I did just want to say that because we're not responding to everything line by line, this question, Austin, throughout all of his chapters, builds in these really silly, oftentimes, questions. And this one just bothered me, so I wanted to talk about it for 1 second. Would you read that for us?
Sure. The chapter doesn't offer, this chapter we're talking about, the chapter doesn't offer external evidence for the truth of the church.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant his question at the very bottom. You can skip
so
that.
this is from his letter. Okay.
Yep.
Austin asks, a big category like happiness has complicated inputs and outputs. With that said, to assume that declining religiosity has no effect or a positive effect on happiness seems far-fetched to me.
Okay, pause there, because I
Yeah.
have to point this out, right? Look at the way he has shifted the burden of proof. Instead of actually establishing that happiness is higher or that declining religiosity has had a negative effect, he's painting it like just saying, I don't know. I don't know the relationship between declining religiosity and negative no effect or positive effects on people. He paints it as an assumption. Isn't that so interesting that if you don't accept his conclusion, you're assuming the opposite? He's making the assumption and then painting it on you in a clear shift of the burden of proof.
Right. And it's far-fetched for anybody to believe that. By the way, this is a good example of where he has shifted his language to make it universal.
Right.
He says, with that said, to assume that declining religiosity has no effect on happiness or a positive effect on happiness seems far-fetched to me. Notice how the language has now become universal.
Right.
And the thing that's so interesting about it to me is that he's saying it in the face of all these quotes of people who are telling him that they're not members of the church anymore and that they are happier now than they were when they were members of the church.
Right.
Well, he's saying, well, that seems far-fetched to me.
Right. 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 It just shows the double standard. Yeah, that's a perfect point. And then this last sentence was really the one that really bothered me. He says, if the world is less religious than ever, Why does it seem that people are worse, not better off?
Who
And I
says
just
they're
wanted-
worse off? Where has he established that? It
Exactly.
seems-
This is fantasy land. To think that the world is in a worse off place than it was when religion had complete control of the Western world is an absolute fantasy. Like, I don't know where this talking point has come from in the last several years. It's a very popular sentiment, and it truly is fantasy. If you look at literacy levels, if you look at longevity, if you look at basically every single metric, we are in a better place now than we were 100 years ago. There are very few areas in which that is not true. And it is a matter of fact that the world is trending less religious. It is just this weird persecution porn level fantasy that religious people are now attempting to say it was religion that brought all of these good things into the world, because religion had its run of the entire world for over 2,000 years. And those were not great times. I'm not sure if Austin, I know he's not much of a reader, but I think if he learned a little bit more about history, he wouldn't say such silly things, because that's why I wanted to talk about this. This idea is so patently ridiculous. We could do an entire podcast on just the way that the world has changed since the Enlightenment, that Austin benefits from every day. And yet, because of his staggering incredulity, he thinks somehow that the world was better when religion ran the entire world. That is not true. Even for the religious people, the world is better because of its decline.
Once upon a time when things were rotten. Yep, this is what he does. So if the world is less religious than ever, why does it seem that people are worse, not better off? By the way, this is also part of the Mormon and common Christian understanding, because it is a doctrine that Jesus is coming back. It's going to be really soon. And before he does, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And so no matter what you see around you as a Mormon or Christian who believes this, no matter how good things are that you see around you, you're going to see only it's getting worse and worse and worse. And this actually resulted in a wonderful duel between President Monson at the time and President Uchtdorf. And President Monson was talking about how horrible the world is getting in the same general conference. And President Uchtdorf got up and said, actually, things are great. And you shouldn't listen to people who are saying that things are getting worse and worse.
Right.
It was an astonishing time. I think they made a special little meme out of it.
Right. Right.
Oh.
And that's not to say that we don't have problems today that we need to solve. There are tons of problems we need to solve, but they're not going to be solved by thinking like this, by lying about the reality that we live in. We are in a much better place than we were 100 years ago as a species. I wanted to connect this one also with begging the question, because we had this conversation on our last episode when we talked about the connection, at least that I see, between Korihor and Thomas Paine. And we read this passage from Alma in Alma 30 when he's having his exchange with Korihor. And we had a little discussion about this argument right here, where Alma says to Korihor that the scriptures are laid before thee, yea, and all things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth and all the things that is upon the face of it. This is because I pulled from the 1830 edition. I did not typo that. This is the brilliant level grammar that the first 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon had. Things that is, and its motion, yea, and also all the planets which move in their regular form doth witness that there is a supreme creator. So here,
that's why you don't have a verse on it.
Yeah.
Because there is no verse in the 1830.
Exactly. And the chapters are much more, they're much longer.
Yeah, it wouldn't even be Alma 30. It'd probably be an earlier number.
Exactly. Korihor asks here for evidence. Alma then says that the world itself is the evidence, but only if you already assume that God made it. This is classic circular logic. The evidence only works as evidence if the conclusion was accepted at the beginning. And I also really liked how you talked about the experience that we have inside of the church, which was very much my experience of telling yourself you're happy. And when I said telling yourself you're happy, I don't even necessarily mean that it's willful behavior, like that people are trying to deceive other people. You are often doing this exercise subconsciously because of the way that the beliefs that you have about the world and what it means to be righteous has helped shape the way you see the world and the way you want to present yourself in the world. And that made me think of this idea from Frank Herbert's Dune. If you'll move to the next slide.
Can I just say that your argument about Korihor and the similarities between him and Thomas Paine is fascinating. And I think that Alma even recognized that to some extent, because Alma considered Korihor to be somewhat of a pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So I don't know if you're a fan of Frank Herbert's Dune, but I am.
No,
And
I've never allowed myself to be. I mean, I tried to watch that movie when it came out in the theaters in the 1980s, and believe me, that turned me off.
that was not a good movie. The new ones are, I think, are rather fantastic, at least. But when I heard Denis Villeneuve was making Dune, which is one of my favorite properties and one of my favorite directors, I was over the moon. Going back to my comments about the world being in a better place than we were 100 years ago. Okay, so Frank Herbert's Dune has a lot of really interesting narratives, especially when you start thinking about religion and the role that religion can play in society. For people who are unaware, Frank Herbert's Dune takes place on a desert planet called Arrakis. It has a galactic emperor, and it has great houses. Think like pre-Game of Thrones, before Game of Thrones was a thing. Think like Game of Thrones in space with space drugs a little bit. It heavily informed Star Wars. It's heavily informed a lot of fiction. And
Dune has?
What's that?
Dune has?
Oh yeah,
I
absolutely.
thought it was Game of Thrones on the beach.
Game of Thrones on the beach. I like that, with sandworms instead of dragons and zombies. And what I mean by Game of Thrones is you've got these great houses, so you've got this weird confluence of like technology and feudalism. So feudalism kind of helps shape the world of Dune. But one of the groups that's most interesting for our purposes today is there's a group of, it's a sisterhood, so exclusively female, that are known as the Bene Gesserit. And the Bene Gesserit are a religious cult, essentially, that are trying to produce, through breeding the right families to the right families, I'm not making this up, breeding the right families to the right families, they are trying to create their Messiah, which is known as the Kwisatz Haderach. You can go ahead and excuse me. Yeah, thank you. I knew it was coming. And because we have this large interplanetary story that takes place over millennia, really, the Dune series does, there is a group in this Bene Gesserit sisterhood, this cult, known as the Missionaria Protectiva. And what these individuals are tasked with doing is going to a planet in the Dune universe, driving up certain superstitions that people who are in the Bene Gesserit later are able to exploit. They are able to fulfill the prophecies that these Missionaria Protectiva have seeded all over the galaxy, because they create very specific narratives and very specific archetypes. I think you can probably see the obvious connection with religion in our world that I see in the Missionaria Protectiva.
I'm still lost at the dirt worms and the zombies. Are they sandworms?
Sandworms.
They got a lot of teeth, whatever they are, right?
They have a lot of teeth. Yep.
Okay.
The point of this is
Wasn't
that
one of those at the beginning of the third Star Wars movie back in 1983?
that's the Sarlacc. That's different.
That's different. Not even related to the sandworms?
Oh, I'm sure Lucas took it right from the sandworms.
Okay, good.
Yeah. The point of this is helping show that it's helping show why begging the question can be such a problem for a religious narrative in particular. Because if you are receiving a message or a prophecy that someone can work to fulfill, you leave yourself able to be exploited. And that's, I think, the point I wanted to make with this idea of the Missionaria Protectiva. It's a big part of the narrative, is that when the main character of the first novel is stranded and his family is left for, well, his entire family is dead and conquered, he and his mother, a member of this Bene Gesserit group, are able to exploit this superstition and these narratives and really claim power, because those narratives were seeded in a way that they're able to fulfill. It is essentially like its own form of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think
in Mormonism, as fascinating as this is,
yes.
In Mormonism, is there a good example of that with the prophecy that Joseph Smith gave that the 12 apostles would leave on their mission to England from the temple in Jackson County? And by the time that they were leaving, the saints had been kicked out of Jackson County. And so they snuck in under cover of darkness on the appointed day, but except it's night. And then they either laid the cornerstone or did something to the cornerstone, and they prayed, and then they took off. Right. So that was something that they could make happen. They could fulfill prophecy by dint of their own ingenuity and labors than they did. Is that similar at all?
Exactly. And it also links up with the concept you were talking about earlier. We're taught from a young age inside of Mormonism that Mormons are happy because Mormons keep the commandments and righteous people are happy. And so I think that's why this idea is so appealing to me. This idea from Herbert is that it helps show the way our brains can do these things without us even being aware. If we want to think of ourselves as righteous, if we want to think of like, who doesn't want to be happy, right? If we want to think of ourselves as righteous and of keeping God's commandments, we want to be happy. And we are often able to create those fruits of the church because the placebo effect is a real thing that we have to guard against in medical trials and studies. And so that's my point here, is that we have to be careful with fruits because it can often act as a circular shield for scrutiny. That's why begging the question on this issue is such a problem.
So if it's a circular shield, it's kind of a buckler, huh?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, don't forget the happiness letter, which gets its name. It's written by Joseph Smith, and it says the same thing, right? Happiness is the object and design of our existence, Joseph Smith taught.
Right.
And it will be the end thereof if we but follow the path that leads to it, which means doing everything I tell you to do, i.e. God telling you through me.
Exactly. And I think there's a great example of this self-fulfilling prophecy, or this idea of building a prophecy in and then fulfilling it, right in the introduction to the Light and Truth letter. So if you'll go to that slide,
Okay.
I think we see a perfect example of this in Austin's introduction. So we've read this a number of times. I'm not going to read the entire thing again. People are familiar with Austin's origin story that's recorded in the introduction. He, has this conversation with his wife, Tikla, and he says, I'll read this bottom paragraph. My wife's reaction surprised me. She did not panic or get defensive. Of course, this is him telling her about losing his faith in God and potentially leaving the church that he never stopped attending.
And he knows she's going to be reading this.
Right. Exactly. Instead, she told me how excited she was for me. By the way, I love my wife very much, and she's fantastic. She did a great job on your panel last week.
She actually did. I will support that. She did a fantastic job. I think she might have been a little bit nervous, but she did great.
Yeah, she's pretty great. So Austin continues and says, I thought I was leaving the church, but she reframed what I was feeling as the start of a journey. Then she made me a promise, and this is the really important line. If I could find more light and truth outside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she would follow me, and she meant it. And what I wanted to point out here, and I think I've talked about this before, is the way Austin and Tikla define light and truth has been entirely shaped by their experience inside of Mormonism. Mm-hmm. So the test that's actually being given here is basically saying, if you can find me a more Mormon worldview outside of Mormonism, I will follow you outside of Mormonism to that more Mormon worldview, because the way that light and truth is defined is entirely informed by their experience inside of Mormonism.
Great point. By the way, I got to clarify, Tammy, when I say you might have been a little bit nervous, what I mean is I think you had expressed that, and in spite of your nervousness, you did sensational. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay.
Fantastic.
Oh, the importance of falsifiability. Who is this individual? Is that Tom Bosley?
This is Sir Karl Popper. It does look like Tom Bosley.
It's close.
Though.
It's close.
Yeah.
Back when he was doing that, Father, he was the priest who solved the mysteries. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Father, son. I never watched it, but anyway, Tom Bosley.
Yeah. Now that we've talked about the two logical fallacies, the last piece I wanted to kind of talk about here for Critical Thinking 101 is to have a conversation about the importance of falsifiability. So this is an idea that was really popularized by Sir Karl Popper, like you said, in the photo here on the right. And I drafted this. Requiring your beliefs to be falsifiable is intellectual honesty. If a belief cannot be proven wrong, it also can't meaningfully be called right. Sir Karl Popper championed the idea for demarcating science from non-science, but I suggest that it can be applied much more broadly than just to scientific experimentation. In that sense, unfalsifiable beliefs aren't wrong. In my view, they're just meaningless. And if I can explain why, it's because I can offer any number of infinite, unfalsifiable explanations for every single proposition. So if we think of the simplest civil case in the world, a car crash where someone supposedly ran a red light. right?
Mhm.
The individual who is going to be found liable can always argue that magic goblins were controlling their car or that magic fairies put them to sleep for a moment. All of those positions
Or
would
we're
be,
changing the lights. Or does it
or
make
we're
any
changing
difference if
lights.
they change the lights? No, it could if the red, if it was actually green on one side and red on the other.
Right. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because so often from apologists, we get these arguments about possibilities. And I just wanted to clarify that possibility means basically nothing. Like anything, almost anything is technically possible. It's when we start talking about probability and plausibility that the apologists often want to represent in the way they present that they're talking about things that are plausible when they're
Yes.
really only often talking about things that are barely, if even, possible. And we can really see that when we look at the idea of falsifiability. And that's why I would defend this idea that unfalsifiable ideas really are just not that interesting to me and are essentially meaningless. Because if I can cobble together an endless string of infinite possibilities of unfalsifiable ideas, how can I select between your unfalsifiable idea or any of the endless scenarios I can come up with?
Speaking of the Book of Abraham, that's exactly what they've been doing since 1967 and even before then, actually. But 67 and the papyri comes out and they find out, yeah, this, okay, so we got to come up with theories that are
Right.
now unfalsifiable because the theory that was falsifiable just got falsified.
Right.
So now we got to go to plan B and plan C and say it's in a different scroll. Okay, can't falsify that. It's in
Right.
a missing part of the scroll. Can't falsify that. It's a catalyst to Joseph Smith receiving a revelation. Can't falsify that. It's some kind of code like Little Orphan Annie decoder ring that the person who wrote it down knew, and then but nobody else knew, right? And Joseph Smith got the code. So that's why it doesn't look like what it's once again non-falsifiable. You've got
Right.
non-falsifiable theory after non-falsifiable theory for the Book of Abraham, and just because you have a lot of them doesn't mean that they're any stronger.
Yeah, it actually helps drive the point home, right? The fact that you can come up with 3 alternative unfalsifiable theories shows that they're absolute bullshit. One good theory is better than 3 completely unfalsifiable theories.
And then I remember that John Gee, famous Egyptologist from BYU, had said in an interview for Fair not too long ago that he had been a champion of the missing scroll theory, okay,
Right.
for a long time. And then he was finally saying, I'm not sure, maybe the catalyst theory, maybe that's right. And I'm going, on what basis could you possibly make such a determination?
Right.
So I think this unfalsifiable theory might be right over my unfalsifiable theory.
Right. Well, that's why they reached ad hoc, right? Or I'm sorry, post hoc. They reached post hoc because the only reason you shift to the catalyst theory is because whatever evidence you were relying on, you know, alleging that there was a missing scroll has fallen. That's the only reason you would shift to a catalyst theory. It's not because there's positive evidence of the catalyst theory in any way. It's because the theory, exactly like you said, the theory that you had that was falsifiable has become falsified. And now you need to shift to something new that's unfalsifiable. Another a perfect example of a logical fallacy we've talked about before is the Mott and the Bailey, right? Retreating to the unfalsifiable position.
Yes, or less easily attacked.
Exactly. And I drew up a good, I think, analogy to help people understand why falsifiability is important, why requiring falsifiable beliefs is important. Imagine here that we had a metal detector that beeped for everything. If you have a metal detector or some test where everything passes or everything signals the test, it's absolutely meaningless, right? And this is why a belief system that confirms itself no matter what you find is also unuseful. And I have this example again from Alma chapter 30. If you're saying all things denote there is a God, this is kind of what we talked about the last time we talked about the scripture. If you're saying all things denote that there is a God, you are literally saying there is no way to falsify this. Everything I would point to proves the test true. Therefore, it's a meaningless test.
I had a little difficulty understanding that the first time you said it, but combining it with this metal detector that works every time, that beeps every time, suddenly made it very clear to me.
Good. I'm glad. That's why I wanted to return to it because I thought you had a lot of good questions on it. It was the claymation that really drove it home, I think.
Love the claymation.
Yeah, it's fun. So here's kind of the phrase when you asked me earlier about that feeling of enlighten my understanding. Here's the phrase that I came up with that helps me feel it today. It's the idea that the discipline of having falsifiable beliefs, or the discipline of falsifiability, is the antidote to the seduction of confirmation bias. And what I mean by that is every single one of our brains wants to be comfortable. They don't like thinking if they don't have to. They want to continue on homeostasis, on the same path they're on. And that's why confirmation bias and the other cognitive biases that we talk about, motivated reasoning, are so appealing. They're like the ruts, the wagon wheel ruts.
Yes.
And
A brain at rest tends to remain at rest unless moved
Right.
upon by an outside force.
That's right. And falsifiability, or having the discipline to say, I want to believe things that are falsifiable and really concern myself with things that are falsifiable, to me, is that first step of building in feedback loops that can help protect you from your own brain's faulty wiring. And so, just as a reminder, confirmation bias is our tendency to notice only what supports what we already believe. But requiring your beliefs to be falsifiable forces you to look for disconfirming evidence, not just continuing to confirm what you already believe. Peter Watson, the researcher that really coined the term confirmation bias, said once that it is a preference for information that is consistent with a hypothesis rather than information which opposes this. Confirmation bias is really, I think, best demonstrated by that quote from Carrie Muhlstein. I start with the assumption that these things are true, and I work backwards from it. The flip side of this coin, or the opposite side of this coin, is requiring your beliefs to be falsifiable before you're willing to hold them so strongly.
Can I give another example from Mormonism? And it has to do with the geography of the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
The geography of the Book of Mormon is not internally consistent. You can't draw a map that matches the geography of the Book of Mormon. You can't do it because it will contradict in some way, because the Book of Mormon contradicts.
Yep.
But there are two main, I'm sorry.
Can I just say, while you're explaining this, I literally tried to do this. I tried to use my personal AI bot to take the text of the Book of Mormon and use it to graph out a map, and it literally said it cannot do it, and highlighted all the areas where the directions are inconsistent, the distances are inconsistent. You cannot do it. So remember this when apologists tell you in the future, the narrative is so complex. How did they get the geography right? They didn't. They just say those things. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you with that.
I would like to do a separate episode on that alone and find out all the things that it can't do because it contradicts. Mm-hmm. I think that would be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for corroborating that point. Okay, so you've got a situation where you can't match. Okay, it's not internally consistent, but still, it's supposed to take place somewhere in the Americas, north, south, central, somewhere in the Americas. Okay,
right.
So you got two competing factions. You got the Heartlanders who think, hey, it happened up here in North America. And you've got the Mesoamerican people, basically farm/fair. It happened down here in Mesoamerica.
Right.
That's where the Book of Mormon, and they're fighting each other. Now, the problem is that the Book of Mormon doesn't match either one of those. Okay.
Right.
You can find some things, sure, but other things are going to contradict. Down in Mesoamerica, same thing. You can find some things, sure, but other things are going to contradict. That's because it's not a match. Mm-hmm. And yet they have both taken positions that are falsifiable.
Right.
Okay. They are falsifiable. And the fact that you have two competing positions should suggest to the disinterested observer that neither one of them are fully satisfactory. Usually you don't have competing factions if one is completely satisfactory. So what the church has done is it's issued a statement making it unfalsifiable and saying the church takes no position other than that it was in the Americas. The church takes no position as to where the Book of Mormon took place. So that is taking something that's falsifiable. It's being falsified. So let's retreat to another position that's unfalsifiable. And the church keeps doing this over and over and over again.
Absolutely. And I have my own example. If you'll move to the next slide, we'll do another one. And I thought this would link perfectly because you covered the Mormonism and the Dead Sea Scrolls earlier this week on Mormonism Live. And this is another great opportunity where falsifiability and Mormonism collide. And I love your example as well. And I think just as a meta point, it's interesting to me how many claims either different prophets or the Book of Mormon or the church generally has made in its past that are falsifiable. There are a huge number of falsifiable propositions that prophets have said and done, as long as you're willing to just take what they said at face value. Then when we get into the weird apologetic games where they try and say skin doesn't mean skin and all of these other type of weird word games and equivocations they like.
The entire famous excuse of he was just speaking as a prophet
Yeah.
is only used because something just got falsified.
Yeah.
So we have to retreat from that and make it unfalsifiable. Well, he wasn't speaking as a prophet, so we can't know. We can't know when someone's speaking as a prophet until and unless it gets contradicted. Then we know he wasn't speaking as a prophet. Same thing with doctrine. We don't know what doctrine is until it changes, and then it's a policy. So that's why my definition of doctrine in the Mormon Church is an unchanged policy.
Yeah, that's a more accurate definition of doctrine than you'll get.
Or is it policy is an unchanged doctrine? Maybe it works both ways. I don't know.
A policy would be a changed doctrine or a previously changed doctrine.
You're right. A policy.
Yep.
Well, actually, policy, it is an unchanged doctrine. You just don't know it's policy until it changes.
Yeah. But people can see the exact problem with having unfalsifiable beliefs, right? It's a tautology. It just changes. The claim just changes when reality changes. That just shows that it's not really falsifiable. And so I thought this would give a good example, and we're just going to do this one example, but kind of get a little bit in depth on the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran that you talked about on Wednesday. And I think this will be a good companion little excerpt for that, because the Great Isaiah Scroll presents a very interesting and rare opportunity. I wouldn't even say they're that rare, but interesting and somewhat rare opportunity to make a component of Mormonism falsifiable. The reason is because Joseph Smith has in the Book of Mormon many chapters that are directly quoting from Isaiah. But the claim in the narrative, at least, is that these came from the brass plates. They weren't being copied from the KJV or the King James Version of the Bible. They were supposedly being copied from the brass plates by Nephi into Nephi's record, written around the time that the Nephites left Jerusalem around 600 BC. Did you have any other framing or introduction you wanted to do on this?
Just that the Book of Mormon presents as having a very early copy of Isaiah, just 100 years or so after he wrote it down, and lots of it's on the gold plates, the brass plates, which gets transcribed onto the gold plates for whatever reason. I don't know, but they thought it was a good idea. And then 1947, Dead Sea Scrolls are found. One of them is the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's called Great because it's so big and it contains the entire book. It's not just fragments, it's an entire scroll of the entire book of Isaiah, which moves now our understanding of what's in Isaiah from 1,000 years after Christ to basically the time of Christ. It's 1,000 years difference. We get our understanding of Isaiah pushed back 1,000 years. And so the expectation would be that this earlier form of Isaiah would have places in it which are closer to the 600 BCE version of Isaiah that's in the Book of Mormon. And here's a great test to show the Book of Mormon is true or not.
Exactly. And if you'll move to the next slide, I just have a picture of that Great Isaiah Scroll where it's held in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Like you said, this one basically backs up our knowledge of earlier manuscripts of Isaiah by 1,000 years. I don't think people recognize how amazing a find this was. And like you said, near complete copy, all 66 chapters of Isaiah. The interesting thing is that this scroll contains errors, corrections, and more than 2,600 textual variants when compared to the earliest manuscript we had before, which is in the Masoretic text. And so this is where it gets interesting, right? Because there are areas where the Book of Mormon quotes from Isaiah, but makes modifications to Isaiah. And so the idea would be, as long as you understand the way time works, that the Book of Mormon's version of Isaiah should line up closer with the Great Isaiah Scroll than it should with the Masoretic text and the version that ultimately makes itself into the King James Bible. If you'll go to the next slide, I have just a reference that I pulled from a publication by Jack Welch and Farms, and I think they borrowed information from Royal Skousen to do this. But you can see there a breakdown of the direct quotations and paraphrases of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. And this was from a publication titled Isaiah Passages in the Book of Mormon. The one we're going to look at in particular is the specific example of Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10. If you'll go to the next slide, I just want to show people where I'm pulling these resources so that if they want to double check me, they are more than welcome to do that. 2 Nephi 12:10 is what becomes Isaiah 2. So at the beginning in the italics that people are familiar with from Bruce R. McConkie, it says compare Isaiah 2 if you're in 2 Nephi 12. This website that I have featured here is where you can go and look at the English translation of the book of Isaiah from this great Isaiah scroll, compared directly to the Masoretic text version that is in, or that informed then, the King James Bible. So you can look scroll by scroll and compare, and they even show you where the modifications are using italics on that website. Again, that you can just find digital Dead Sea Scrolls. Very interesting information. If you'll go to the next slide, I'll show people these resources. There's a lot of stuff here, but don't worry, we break it down on the next slide. So what we have on the left and what we're going to look at is the 1769 version of the King James Bible, the Bible version that Joseph Smith would have had access to in his home. We're then going to look at the 2 Nephi version. We're then going to look at the same the analysis of the same verse in Adam Clarke's Bible commentary, and then we will look at the Great Isaiah Scroll version. I don't want to bury the lead on this, so if you'll just go to the next slide, we will look at that. So on the left-hand side, I've got the verse as it appears in the 1769 King James Version. In the middle, I have the same verse from the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, what today is recorded in 2 Nephi 12:10. The modifications in red, all of the modifications are in red. So if it's modified from the 1769 King James Version, it's in red. So if you wouldn't mind reading the 1769 King James version of this, and then I'll read the others.
And the 1769 is significant because that's the version that Joseph Smith had.
Exactly.
Okay, so here's what it says. Enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty.
The 1830 Book of Mormon edition of that same verse adds to the beginning, ye wicked ones. Then it continues along the same way, except that it omits the word for. So I've indicated that in italics. And then it adds onto the end of the phrase, for the glory of his majesty. And then the Book of Mormon version adds, shall smite thee. So that's a change from the 1769 version. It's interesting then when you look at Adam Clarke's Bible commentary on this same verse, that Adam Clarke adds to the end of that phrase in his commentary, or suggests adding on to the end of that phrase, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to strike the earth with terror. And Adam Clarke justified this addition by pointing out that the same verse, or the same phrase, appears in verse 19 and I think 21 of the same chapter, and saying that based on an earlier manuscript, he believed that this was missed from the Masoretic text version, that it should have been included. So that's why I've indicated this.
So what Adam Clarke adds is, when God ariseth to strike the earth with terror. And what Joseph Smith adds in the Book of Mormon is, the glory of his majesty shall smite thee. So there does appear to be a connection between shall smite thee and shall strike the earth with terror.
Yes, and in fact, this is one of the verses that Colby Townsend's recent research on the use of Adam Clarke's Bible, the use of the Adam Clarke Bible commentary in the Book of Mormon, is where I pulled this specific example from, because he sees this as a thematic parallel. And looking at it, it's pretty obvious why, because that language that Joseph Smith adds, shall smite thee, doesn't come from the 1769 version. And you can see a clear explanation of it if one was looking at the Adam Clarke Bible commentary, which we know that Joseph Smith had access to.
So what does the Great Isaiah Scroll have to say about Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10?
Yeah, so this is a great snippet from one of my favorite television shows, Arrested Development. It just says footage not found, because here's the reality, is the Great Isaiah Scroll version of this verse is not there. This verse is omitted in its entirety, and the second half of verse 9, in fact, the verse before it, is also omitted. And so what this indicates to the professors who worked on the Great Isaiah Scroll, and in fact did the translation that we were reading from earlier, or that I demonstrated earlier on the page, is this suggests that this was a later addition to the version of Isaiah that we have in our Bibles today. In other words, that as the text was negotiated by future generations from when it was originally written, that verse was added for whatever reason and wasn't present in the original version of Isaiah. Here's where we connect this idea to falsifiability. Can you imagine for a moment if this discovery of the Great Isaiah Scroll in 1947 lined up exactly with a change that Joseph Smith made to Isaiah as it's captured in the Book of Mormon? In other words, if when you got to 2 Nephi 12:10, what is actually Isaiah 2:11 was there, and this verse was missing, this would be a direct hit for Joseph Smith's claim, or for the claim in the Book of Mormon about where it came from. It would at least,
especially if it weren't reflected in the Adam Clark commentary.
exactly. If it weren't reflected in the Masoretic text version and Adam Clark didn't say anything about it, that would be the best case scenario. We would be able to point, and I would, and say, this actually is evidence that Joseph Smith's claim, or the claim in the Book of Mormon about where the Book of Mormon came from, at least is that piece of evidence alone would seem to suggest that it is true. It would make it more likely that it is true. Instead, we don't see that. We see that Joseph Smith is borrowing material, at least it seems, from the Adam Clark Bible commentary. And I think because this is a little bit complicated, I did have a conclusion slide just on this thought to kind of wrap it up. And then
But what about seraphim?
I didn't include that one, but that's a great example too. And you know, it's
By
funny.
the way, there are some kind of really unusual interpretations that Joseph Smith does of Isaiah, and I can't remember if it's in the Book of Mormon or his JST. But one of them is where it refers to in Isaiah the waters of Judah, which Joseph Smith then changes. Well, he doesn't change. He says, or the waters of baptism. Now that's weird to have in the Old Testament, or the waters of baptism. And
Before
if the Great
baptism
Isaiah
was a
Scroll
concept.
or any early Isaiah said the waters of Judah or the waters of baptism, it would be astonishing. That would be remarkable, especially if it's not in Adam Clark, and I don't think it is. But it's not. There is none.
Right.
There's nothing like it. Where we would expect to find confirmation, we don't find it.
Right, exactly. And I will also point out that because of the way the Dead Sea Scrolls work, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls is a collection of books. It's a library of different documents and manuscripts. There were different versions of Isaiah, because the Great Isaiah Scroll manuscript version, they like number them, and they have a system so that they can keep them cataloged. Is 1Q Isaiah A. That's the scroll that like that's the delineation of it.
It's found in the first cave.
What's that?
Found in the first cave, 1Q.
Exactly.
Q for Qumran.
Yeah. And there were also versions of Isaiah that were found in that same library where they found the Great Isaiah Scroll that were dated to later, that do have this verse in it. So that is very conclusive evidence that this was a later addition. To have it not present in one version of the scroll, then present in a later version of the scroll that's collected in the same library, helps show the evolution that we see in the Bible's transmission.
Very interesting. You said this is a conclusion slide?
Yeah, just because I know we've talked about a lot of dates and we've talked about it. I just wanted to really sum up here, which is the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is dated to about 125 BC, but between 150 and 100, is over 1,000 years older than any manuscript Joseph Smith could have accessed. And it provides an opportunity to test whether the Book of Abraham preserves an ancient independent version of Isaiah.
Or the Book of Mormon.
Right. But the Book of Mormon's Isaiah chapters don't match the Great Isaiah Scroll. Instead, they closely align with the 1769 King James Bible and some portions of the Adam Clark Bible commentary, including translation errors, interpretive flourishes, and even punctuation choices. The Great Isaiah Scroll gave Mormonism a chance to prove its ancient roots. Instead, it exposed modern, relative to Joseph, fingerprints. It exposed modern fingerprints relative to Joseph. And what I mean by that is there have been so many of these examples in Mormonism's history, whether it was DNA and the Book of Mormon. There are just so many examples I can think of. The Book of Abraham as an entire issue is one of those as well, where Joseph Smith could have been vindicated, or the claims of the church could have been vindicated. And I'm unaware of a single change that the Dead Sea Scrolls, where, let me say this differently. I am unaware of a single change to Isaiah made in the Book of Mormon that is vindicated by the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. I would agree with that, with the additional clause. that is not also reflected in the Adam Clark Bible commentary.
Yes. Yeah, great point. I did on that specific example, and you actually mentioned the seraphims thing. If you'll go to the next slide,
Yeah, I
just
love the
because
seraphims.
I wanted to see if any apologists have dealt with this issue. And they don't deal with this verse specifically, but Fair Mormon did have an entry dealing with Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Book of Mormon. And this was their argument essentially in response, which is, well, we don't know what the original text of Isaiah was. It should be noted that we don't know what the original text of Isaiah was as composed by Isaiah. We have early textual witnesses, such as the Great Isaiah Scroll, which we've talked about, recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this is not the original text as composed by Isaiah. Let's actually take their argument to its logical conclusion and talk about what they're actually saying. What they're saying is that the Book of Mormon, which includes versions that are in later editions of Isaiah or later manuscripts in Isaiah, the original version of Isaiah must have included this language. And for some reason, the earliest manuscript we have, the Great Isaiah Scroll, simply doesn't have it there. So that would mean that we have a message that's in the original version of Isaiah, somehow lost in the Great Isaiah Scroll, and then is recreated by later scribes to exactly match what was in the original Isaiah. It's really, really ridiculous when you stop and think about it, when the much more simple explanation is exactly like the scholars at the Digital Dead Seas and that translated the Dead Sea Scroll say, is that verse is a later addition by scribes and wasn't in the original Isaiah. There'd be no reason to conclude otherwise, aside from the need to.
It's another example of taking something where you've got a premise that appears to be being falsified. So what we have to do is move it into an area where it's non-falsifiable, because we're never going to have an original copy of Isaiah. So as long as we'll never have a copy, the Book of Mormon can still be true, regardless of the evidence that's being mounted against it. And it's getting bigger and bigger. By the way, a similar thing happened in 1912 when the several non-Mormon scholars came out with their devastating study about the Book of Abraham facsimiles that are published with the Book of Abraham, because the papyri had not been rediscovered. That wouldn't happen until 1967. So like 55 years later, I think. But the church did a response, and they collected a bunch of different people who wrote up responses. And one of the common themes in those responses to say why this wasn't devastating to Joseph Smith's prophetic ability in the Book of Abraham. We don't have the papyrus yet. We don't know if this was accurately transcribed or copied, these facsimiles from the papyrus. And we need to have the papyrus before we'll be able to answer these questions. Well, the papyrus came out 55 years later, and it wasn't favorable to the Mormon community. So we start coming up with missing scrolls and missing endings of scrolls and catalyst theories and Little Orphan Annie codes. I'm not kidding. That is actually out there. I think John Twetness was the person who promoted that. And there's, Ed Goebel's got a crazy idea too, doesn't he, about the Book of Abraham, Kolby?
Yep, he sure does. He has an idea about the Book of Abraham.
Can you tell us about Ed Goebel? Did he you were having a conversation and then he got mad, he's on vacation, you're asleep, and he's just like blowing up your cell phone with all these texts. Was that happening recently?
I do not want to talk about that on the air.
Okay. All right. Well,
you're a good sport.
I am a very, very good sport. And I think Ed Goebel is a good sport too. Would you agree with me on that, Kolby?
I will neither confirm nor deny.
All right. Did you want to go to the next slide?
I would like to talk about David Hume and not Ed Goebel. That would be perfect.
Hume? David Hume?
The reason I wanted to end with Hume, who is a famous Scottish philosopher, is because I think sometimes when going back to the idea of epistemological humility, when we were talking about why fallacies matter, there's sometimes, I think, when we have these discussions that believers can feel like we're saying, if there's one area where Mormonism can be falsified that doesn't work, then it's absolutely false. That's not exactly what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I'm saying that we need to be aware of the way that our brains are hardwired to think and the flawed ways that our brains are hardwired to think. And if we're doing that, I really like this quote from Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where he said, in our reasonings concerning matter of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance, from the highest certainty to the lowest species of moral evidence. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. And the reason I like this statement so well, especially that last sentence, is because that is, I think, the real key to understanding critical thinking and epistemology 101. It's not to say that if there's some piece of evidence that you should expect that isn't there, that Mormonism is absolutely false. But it's to say that as more and more of these, bricks come and are laid in place, we need to look at the whole picture, look at the forest and the trees, and think about what it means for our beliefs. And at least if people are going to continue to believe based on an argument that is demonstrably fallacious, they need to hold that conclusion a little bit looser and maybe a little bit kinder. And I mean that as applied to myself also. When there are things that I know I can't absolutely validate, I want to hold those conclusions loosely and subject to change. I think that can give us that feedback loop, that positive feedback loop, that accountable feedback loop that we're looking for that can help guard us against our flawed thinking.
Very good. Oh, this was mine. I added this one. So this is the end of his chapter. And now he's going to quote from President Nelson, which is going to say the exact same thing that I was saying at the beginning. I was so excited to find this in his chapter. This is where it's right before the footnotes. So he starts this, leads into it by saying a stable identity is one of the greatest gifts the Church of Jesus Christ of... Geez. If you just left out the full name of the church, this thing would be half as long. Okay. The Mormon Church has given given me stable identity. I know who I am. He's got a story, where I fit in the story and where I'm going. Okay, so he's taught who he is, and this gives him identity, and this is helpful. So here he is quoting
I'll just say this is exactly like that idea we were talking about from Dune. It's they give you your identity, and then you find yourself in that identity. Any belief system can do this.
Yes, very good. Yeah. And they do that with the Lamanites as well.
Right.
My dear friends, you are literally spirit children of God. So that's the start of this quote from President Nelson. And it goes down to the paragraph, which I've circled in yellow. I promise, President Nelson speaking, I promise that you will experience spiritual growth, freedom from fear, and a confidence that you can scarcely imagine now. You will have strength to have a positive influence far beyond your natural capacity. This is all the stuff you do if you realize who you are and you follow the Mormon way. And I promise you that your future will be more exhilarating than anything you can presently believe. 2022, it's just 3 years ago that he's giving this talk. Russell M. Nelson, that's being quoted here. This is a classic example of the promises that are made ad infinitum. The entire idea of a patriarchal blessing is based upon this idea that you are promised what it is, all the wonderful things that will happen to you, how happy you will be, how exhilarated you will be, how you'll have the strength to have a positive influence as long as you obey the Mormon gospel. Mm-hmm. Then you will have all these things added unto you. So it ends up being a system where everybody knows that everybody believes, I'll put knows in quotations, air quotes, if they are faithful, they will be happy. Therefore, everybody pretends to be happy. Nobody can be perfect. That's the problem with Mormonism. You are told that if you are perfect and exact in your obedience, right? People will be saying, oh, we don't say perfect. Look at Matthew 5:48. It's in 2 Nephi 2, okay? Matthew 5:48 and how it's interpreted by the church. Be ye therefore perfect, even as I or your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the one from 3 Nephi. He leaves himself out of it in Matthew. As your Father in heaven is perfect, right? Be ye therefore perfect. You must follow things with exactness in order to gain the blessings. So we understand that we have to be perfect. We also know that we can't be perfect. So therefore, we have to pretend to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And we know that if we're perfect, we'll be happy. If we're righteous, we will be happy. Therefore, we pretend to be happy because that shows that we are righteous. And you get all these people going to church every Sunday. Like I say, church is a place we go on Sunday to pretend we're perfect. Well, we do that by pretending we're happy. Mm-hmm. We look at everybody else pretending they're happy and realize we're a fake. Mm-hmm. But we think they're all real, which makes us spiral down further. And then we go to the doctor and we get some prescription meds. which is why Utah is one of the highest states in terms of their antidepressant consumption. It is a system that is, it's not, I don't think it's designed to do this, but it might as well be designed to inculcate depression in its members. Okay. And that's what this whole thing is about, pretending that you're happy. So when you get the call from the person who's doing the survey, what religion are you? I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How would you rank your happiness? 10? Don't you have an 11 on here? Of course, it's not going to be true. And this is one of the many ways, one of the primary ways, actually, that Mormonism makes liars of us all.
And it links with that conversation we had about an hour ago, dealing with this same issue. And what it makes me think of is, I mean, I think one of the greatest, you can call it blessings or synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. One of the greatest advantages I have in my worldview today, no longer being an active member of the church, is that I recognize that feelings are a fleeting thing. Sometimes you just wake up and you're in a bad mood, or you're feeling anxious, or you're feeling afraid. And when I was a Mormon, because we're taught so often that our feelings are the way God speaks to us, and we have to watch. It's literally in Second Nephi or in King Benjamin's sermon, where he says, "I cannot tell you all the ways you can sin, but you need to watch yourselves constantly, and watch your intentions, watch your heart, watch your action." It's something that leads people down that road. I never got to the point that I needed medication for it, but I often grappled with those feelings of inadequacy and those feelings of agonizing and turning over a feeling in my mind over and over and over again, especially the negative ones, because you're taught that those negative ones can be coming from literal Satan. So you need to figure out, is this an actual just passing bad feeling, or did I do something wrong, or did I commit some sin which I'm unaware of, which is also right in King Benjamin's thing, right? That's implicit in what he's saying, that there's ways you can sin that you don't even know, which demonstrates again the internal inconsistency of Mormonism, because you're taught that you can't sin without knowledge that you're sinning. Basically, that's the difference between a sin and a transgression. And I think this all is just part and parcel of the same thing, is leaving this additional level of reality that cannot be demonstrated behind allows you to just deal with life as it is. There are days I wake up, I said right before we started filming that I had to take a sick day today because I just am feeling bad. And there are some days that you have that, and it doesn't have to mean anything other than that. If you don't want it to, you can just deal with that feeling as it is, and it will pass.
I have to tell you, I had a dear friend. He didn't talk to me anymore after I kind of went all Radio Free Mormon on him, by which I mean started a podcast. I wasn't trying to talk to him and convert him away from the church. I don't do that. But he was a member of stake presidency at one point. And I think it was while he was a member of the stake presidency, one of the counselors, that he talked to me about how he resolve things in his world. And he said, you know, me and my family, they're great family. Okay. They got their problems like everybody else, but trying to be very, very faithful. And the way he resolved things was that, you know, when good things happen to me and my family, I know it's because we're being blessed, because we're trying as hard as we can to follow all the commandments. And without missing a beat, he said in the next breath, and when bad things happen to me and my family, I know it's because Satan is trying to get us because we're trying so hard to follow all the commandments. So all roads lead to Rome.
Right. That's our faulty faulty metal detector that goes off no matter what passes underneath it, right?
Yes.
Bad thing happens, God. Good thing happens, God. It leads you back exactly like you said. All roads lead to Rome. Perfect point.
Well, thank you. And I want to bring up a point of order in this letter, okay? Because this stood out to me. I'm not sure I'd seen a lot of this before. And these are a couple of examples. Over and over again, there's like 5 or 6 examples where he starts his sentences, indeed his paragraphs, with a footnote. I'm not aware of this kind of procedure. I'm used to putting footnotes at the end of sentences. Have you ever seen this before?
Nope, not once.
I
Sometimes
looked it up. I tried to look it up in a style, manual, and it says, well, the footnotes go at the end of the sentence.
Did you ask ChatGPT if this is a valid citation convention?
No, I don't talk to computers.
Okay.
They keep coming on to me. I don't know what it is. They find me attractive, I think.
I'd just be interested what it would. It's funny. I'm glad that your pedantry got the better of you, because I looked at this and thought that's a dumb citation, but then I feel like I've gotten flack for critiquing Austin's writing But yeah,
We're not only critiquing every word. Now we're critiquing the little tiny numbers in the superscript, right?
Yep.
So yeah, and it's not like he's got one at the end of the sentence. So he's trying to, put one at the beginning so it'll stay. No, it's just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever AI program that you had do this for you, Austin, doesn't know how to do footnotes, at least not consistently. Footnotes come at the end of sentences, and they're supposed to stand for the proposition that's set forth in the sentence. And you've got problems with that too, as we've seen before. All right. So I think that is it. Yeah, it is. Do you have anything you want to say here in conclusion?
I have to go on a 5-minute monologue just to make sure we go over 2 hours. No, I'm joking. I have nothing else to say. I think that well, I hope that people appreciate this kind of step back from the step-by-step claims in Austin's letter and looking at them in depth and focusing on kind of the meta point of what point is he actually making, because the entire exercise we've gone through is to explain why, even if we granted him every single argument he has in this section of the letter, it is completely meaningless if you are concerned about the actual truth of the underlying truth claims of the church. That's what I'm concerned with. And if people are not concerned with that, if they want to find meaning in the church, if it's their community, it's their tradition, I have no qualms about that. It's really just the people like Austin that I feel like overrepresent the truth claims or under deliver the evidence on the truth claims that I have issue with. And I think this demonstrates why, because I really care if the things I believe are true.
Well, we want to once again reach out to our good friend Austin Fife and give you an invitation to come on the show. The door's open for you. We leave the lights on. The red carpet's rolled out. What do we have to do, Austin, to get you to come on the show and talk about your freaking letter? The one that you said over and over in the letter is written to the critics of the church, which I think is us. So come on the show, Austin. Everybody wants to see you come on the show. We'll talk about things. We'll be nice. We're nice guys, but we just want to ask a few questions and maybe then a few follow-up questions, and hopefully you can answer them for us. So thanks so much for coming on, Kolby. It was great to see you again. We've only got about 3 more chapters, possibly 4 left in this entire thing, but we are going to go through this entire letter. So this can be a resource for anybody who wonders whether the Light on Truth letter is really something that they can use to buttress their faith in the Book of Mormon and in the LDS Church. So everybody hit like, hit subscribe. We're going to end under 2 minutes, which means that in the time left that we normally would record, people could go out to the movie theater and catch Mission Impossible, the latest installment. They could watch the whole thing in the time that we normally would be recording. So we're doing you a favor here. Please hit like, please hit subscribe. That's your favor to us in return for keeping it under 2 hours. And please join us next time on Radio Free Mormon, where I think we're going to be covering the chapter that deals with the temple, the ancient temple, the temple and ancient connections. That's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you'll join us. Until then, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.